In November 2015, one of the vital electrical components of the International Space Station broke, limiting the power to the astronauts on board. And I was one of 2 astronauts who had to go on a spacewalk and restore power back to the International Space Station. I'm Tim Peake, and this is Mission Spacewalk. I was selected as an astronaut in 2009 by the European Space Agency, and in 2015, as part of mission Principia, I had to fly to space and spend 6 months living and working on the International Space Station. I launched from Baikonur in Kazakhstan on a Soyuz rocket, about 50 meters tall, weighs about 300 tons, only takes 8 minutes and 48 seconds to get up into space. That's about 4 Gs of acceleration that takes you from 0 to 17,500 miles per hour. It's a great ride. In the Soyuz with me was Tim Kopra from NASA. He was on his 2nd mission to space. And Yuri Malenchenko from Roscosmos. He was on his 6th mission to space, a very experienced crew member. Space Station is an incredible laboratory in space. We've taken it from 1 G here on Earth to 0 G, where everything floats. And that means you can do some really interesting things. You can create pharmaceutical drugs that we can't make back here on Earth. And we're only just scratching the surface of what is possible up in space. When we fly to space, we don't know if we're going to get a spacewalk. We don't know what might break outside. But in our case, when we launched, the sequential shunt unit had already broken about a month before, so it was really important to repair this unit so that we could restore full power to the space station. We can do spacewalks from 2 locations on the International Space Station, either down from the Russian segment or from the American segment. I was doing a spacewalk from the American segment with my crewmate Tim Kopra, EV1, and of course myself, EV2. But it's not just 2 people outside doing a spacewalk. There's a whole team of people who support us. Inside the space station was our commander, Scott Kelly. He was IV. Now that's the person who helps us get ready in our spacesuits, gets us out the hatch, looks after us from the inside of the space station whilst we're out on a spacewalk, making sure everything is running smoothly, and most importantly, helps us get back inside safely at the end of the spacewalk. Then there's the whole team of people back down in mission control. We were speaking specifically just to one person during the spacewalk. That was Reed Wiseman. Now, Reed is actually the person who's recently commanded the Artemis II mission around the moon. And then there's the back rooms. They're the people who have trained us for so many months. The engineering teams who are looking after things like our spacesuit, making sure it's working. The electrical teams, because we were working on a solar panel, that was going to be so important for them to be monitoring that power. And vitally, did it work or did it not? And of course, it's not just NASA that run the space station. There are 5 space agencies that were involved in building it. So we've got Houston, which of course is in the United States, the main mission control center. We've got Roscosmos, Moscow Mission Control Center. We've got Munich Mission Control Center, the European Space Agency. We've got the Japanese Space Agency just outside of Tokyo, and Canada are also vital partners of the International Space Station. So in total, there are hundreds, if not thousands of people working around the world to support us on this operation. Space is probably one of the most hostile environments to try and live and work in. There is no atmosphere in space, it's a vacuum. So without any atmosphere, there's no pressure. You would be dead in less than 60 seconds if you did not have a spacesuit on. You'd be unconscious probably in 6 seconds. It would be that quick. In the sunshine, you're exposed to searing temperatures, 120 Celsius, maybe even more, and then in the shade down to minus 150 Celsius. And that can happen really quickly too. And then there's the radiation from the sun. We get protected from that radiation down here on Earth through our atmosphere. We don't have that same level of protection in space. So it's a really tough place to try and live and work. So the space station is traveling at 17,500 miles per hour. And it weighs about 420 tons. And those 8 big solar panels, they produce about 240 kilowatts. But that's a bit difficult to understand, so I'm going to use Gemini to help compare that to things on Earth. Hey Gemini, give me real-world comparisons for Earthlings about the ISS orbit speed, weight on Earth, and the power of its solar arrays. So this is what Gemini has to say about how fast the space station is traveling. It's like the ultimate cross-country road trip. If your car could drive at ISS speed, you could travel from London to Edinburgh in about 1 minute and 15 seconds. Now that would be cool, wouldn't it? In terms of the weight, it's equivalent to the combined weight of about 70 adult African elephants. You certainly wouldn't want that trampling all over you. If you wanted to use all of that space electricity at once on Earth, you could power simultaneously about 160 standard kitchen ovens at full power. You'd cook a lot of Christmas turkeys with that. So hopefully those real-world comparisons help you to understand what the International Space Station is really like. Thanks, Gemini. So let's talk about the kit. I said that space is one of the most hostile environments to try and live and work in, and your spacesuit is the thing that has to keep you alive out there. So your spacesuit is like a small space station. These things cost over $1 million per piece. The first thing it has to do is provide the atmosphere that's not there in space. So it's got to give you all the oxygen that you need to breathe, and we're breathing out carbon dioxide. So we have a metal oxide canister that's constantly scrubbing the CO2 that we breathe out. But what's going to protect us from those temperatures that I spoke about? So the spacesuit itself is made up of about 14 layers, and a lot of those layers of material are to protect us from the radiation coming from the sun, but also they're to keep us warm inside the spacesuit. So they're reflecting all of our body heat back in towards us. But what about if we need something to drink? Our spacesuit's got to provide that for us as well. This is the water pouch that we use. So we stick this to the inside of what we call the hard upper torso, the upper part of the spacesuit, and this straw will poke up into our helmets. So during the spacewalk, we can kind of move our mouth around and have a drink of water. There's probably about 1.5 litres worth of water in that pouch there. Can't eat anything, unfortunately, so you have to have a good breakfast the morning of your spacewalk. And then what if we look directly at the sun? Well, the sun is just a nuclear furnace, and if we were to look at it from space, we'd be blinded, just like you would here on Earth. So we have to have a visor down in the daylight. That visor happens to have a very thin coating of gold metal, because gold is really good at protecting our eyes from that solar radiation. We've got gloves and boots, of course. The gloves, we have 50 different sizes. It's really important to have that dexterity in your fingertips. So what would happen if we did get a hole in our spacesuit that was really big? Well, if we got exposed to that vacuum of space, we've got all of this gas trapped inside our blood. Most of that is nitrogen. And if you release the pressure on the outside, that could go to your brain and your heart, and it could kill you. It's what divers call decompression sickness, or the bends. So to demonstrate this, if I shake up this bottle of fizzy water, now in there's lots of carbon dioxide that's trapped under pressure. That's like the bloodstream inside our spacesuit. But if you get a hole in the spacesuit, all those bubbles come rushing to the surface in your blood, straight to the brain, straight to the heart. That will kill you. Training for a spacewalk is so important. You wouldn't dream of trying to do one without hours of meticulous preparation. And to help us, we've got a pool, a swimming pool. It's about 12 meters deep, and that water gives us neutral buoyancy. It's not the same as weightlessness, but we can float underwater, and it's a bit like being on a spacewalk. Also, we use virtual reality, because if we fall off the space station, which would be a really bad day, we've got a small jetpack. It's called Safer, and that gives us about 20 seconds worth of nitrogen gas. And using those thrusters, we could hopefully find the space station and fly ourselves back there. It's really difficult to know how to fly a jetpack without training, and so we use the virtual reality environment to practice. The other thing that virtual reality is really good for is helping to practice do the spacewalk before we actually go out the hatch. And so we can look at those translation paths. This is the route that we're going to take. It's a bit like a rock climber studying the rock face that you're about to try and climb. You can practice those handholds and reaches and make sure that it's the best route for getting where you need to work. All of this planning and preparation, it really gives us confidence, and that helps us stay calm under pressure and to know that we are capable of doing the job that we're being asked to do. For every spacewalk, of course, it's really important to have a great plan. Now for us, we had to go and repair this sequential shunt unit at the furthest edge of the space station. We were going to plan on being out the door for about 6.5 hours on this spacewalk. And for us, it was really important to replace this unit during darkness, because there's live raw electricity coming down that solar panel, and to touch it during the daytime would risk an electric shock. So we have to wait for darkness. Now, the space station's going from daylight to darkness every 45 minutes, because we're orbiting the planet every 90 minutes. To help demonstrate this, I'm going to get Gemini. Hey Gemini, create me an insightful, photorealistic infographic which shows the International Space Station's 16 daily orbits. I want it to be vivid but simple, showing the exact path the ISS takes every 90 minutes. Fantastic, here we go. So you can see how the space station is orbiting around the planet. Each one of these lines represents a space station orbit. And because the Earth is spinning underneath us, and that is going from west to east, each orbit kind of moves back every time we go around the planet. So at one point we might be over Europe, and then that marches backwards over the Atlantic, and then over to America, and then over to the Pacific during a day. 16 orbits in one day. And so we have 45 minutes of daylight and 45 minutes of darkness. Thanks, Gemini. So I had trained, I had prepared so thoroughly for this spacewalk, but even so, in those final days leading up to it, I was still a bit nervous. I was studying the routes that I was going to take. I was looking out the hatch windows, trying to see which areas were going to be really challenging. I was using virtual reality to practice my spacewalk again and again. But actually, when I went out the door, all of those nerves disappeared. At 12:55 GMT on the 15th of January 2016, we started the mission. Tim, Kopra and myself were in the airlock with so many bags, it was packed. And when Tim opened the hatch, sunlight just flooded in. Tim went out first. I handed him all the kit and equipment, being really careful not to snag ourselves with these tethers. And then it was my turn to exit the airlock hatch. That was a really proud moment because Scott Kelly on the inside saw me going out the hatch, and he said that's the first time that Union flag has been in the vacuum of space. And so once we got outside, Tim Kopra had to go halfway down the truss section and put our safety tethers in place. And that gave me, as a rookie spacewalker, a few moments just to hang out underneath the airlock and get used to my environment. Now at this point, we're actually in nighttime. So all I could actually see was the sort of 1 meter pool of light illuminated by my helmet. And then once Tim had anchored our safety tethers, I started moving down towards where he was. I was carrying with me this sequential shunt unit. This was the new unit called Dusty. Called Dusty because it had been on the space station since 1999. That's a long time, but we had started it up and it had worked inside the space station. But it weighs 80 kilograms. So on top of that, and the weight of my spacesuit and the weight of me inside, my whole unit was 300 kilograms, a third of a ton that I was having to maneuver down the space station. The plan was that Tim Kopra and I would exit the airlock here, and we had to go up this thing called a seater spur that takes us to the main truss along the space station. And then on that main truss, work our way outwards across this thing here, which is called the solar array rotary joint. That's a really tricky part of the spacewalk because most of the space station's got handrails that you can hold onto, but not that bit. That's what allows the solar panels to rotate 360 degrees. So there's just steel tubes and they're really big diameter, so you can't grip onto them properly and you have to just kind of really gently tease your way across that joint. And then you're onto the outer segment of the space station. We had to go all the way along and anchor ourselves at the furthest edge. That whole process took about 45 minutes to get from the airlock to the solar arrays. And then we had to get ready for replacing the unit. Because when we went into the shadow, we were only going to get 31 minutes to take this old unit off and put the new unit back on again. And as soon as the sun went down, Tim had to start to break the torque on that unit. Now that was really hard. We hadn't anticipated that bolt being on so tightly. I was having to hand him all the tools and he was having to use a ratchet wrench in order to break the torque and then to be able to remove this unit. Now, bearing in mind this unit hadn't been used for many, many years, it was really a nervous point when we were bolting that thing in place. Would it work or would it not? But Tim was able to drive that bolt home. We got a very good seal on that unit, and that was job done. First part of the mission absolute success. And as we were packing up, the sun came up, and Mission Control even were able to tell us right then that we had got a good connectivity with that new SSU and electrical power had been restored to the space station. My job was then to carry the failed unit back to the airlock. Now there was one part that caught me by surprise here, because as I was going down this small metal pole called a seater spur, and it's probably about 10 meters long, I was halfway along it and I looked down and I saw Australia beneath me and suddenly got this feeling of vertigo, and I found myself gripping on really tightly. But actually it just took a moment, take a deep breath, you're not going to fall, relax and carry on moving. So I got that old unit back into the airlock, Tim met me, and then we started phase 2 of this spacewalk. Now my job at this point was to lay down about 91 feet of electrical cable. That's a really demanding task because each part of the cable has to be anchored to handrails. And to do that, we use these copper wires. These are wire ties. And these are actually wire ties that were out there in space on my spacewalk. And then I had to maneuver myself into a really tricky part on the space station. It's called the rat's nest because there are so many cables and wires there which all create hazards. You can get snagged, you can get stuck in these small gaps. Meanwhile, Tim Kopra was working a little bit further away from me. And the two of us, of course, are talking to each other, but I was busy putting down these cables. And then after about 4 hours and 15 minutes, I heard Tim Kopra call up and say that he could see some water coming into his spacesuit helmet. Now, clearly one thing you don't want to happen on a spacewalk is to have your helmet fill up with water. And we had had an incident of this previously in 2013 when ESA astronaut Luca Parmitano had been out on his second spacewalk and he ended up with 1.5 liters worth of water in his helmet, because one of the components that keeps all that cooling water flowing through our life support system had allowed the water to get into the ventilation system. At that point, the decision was made by Mission Control to terminate the spacewalk. We were into something called the cuff checklist. Now, this is emergency procedures that we wear on our wrist. We had to safe our working areas, make sure that we weren't going to leave too much of a mess outside the space station, and then with some sort of urgency, get Tim back into the airlock. So he started maneuvering his way back, and I had to work my way all the way back through this rat's nest and down through that very tricky gap where I'd had to squeeze myself through in order to get up there in the first place. And that was probably my biggest concern was, how am I going to do this caving expedition in a really short space of time to be able to help Tim out? And as EV1, normally, he would be the last person in from the spacewalk. His job was to close everything up, shut the hatch, and end the spacewalk. But the decision was made to swap roles. So Tim went into the hatch first, I had to clean up outside, and then it was my turn to come in last, shut the hatch, and then with the hatch safely closed, Scott Kelly, on the inside, he could then repressurize the airlock in order to bring us back into the space station safely. That's the moment where I kind of breathed a sigh of relief, because until that hatch is closed, there's no way for you to get back inside the space station. You could just be stuck. So a spacewalk that was designed to last about 6 hours, we had to cut it short to about 4 hours and 43 minutes because of this problem, but it was still 4 hours and 43 of the best minutes of my life. So despite having to terminate the spacewalk a little bit early, it was a complete success. The SSU was up and running. We'd restored full electrical power back to the space station. And once we knew that everybody was safe from that mission, it was an incredible feeling. As the first British ESA astronaut to do a spacewalk, I was really proud, of course, to have done that. And from a personal point of view, looking down at your home planet, it really does give you that change in perspective, something astronauts call the overview effect. I found being out in space, once I relaxed, one of the most exciting but also serene and peaceful experiences. It's the most amazing thing I've ever done, and if I got the chance to do it again, I would in a heartbeat. And this Union flag here, this is actually the backup flag for my spacesuit. The first one that I actually wore on my spacesuit, I presented to Her Majesty Queen Elizabeth II, and that now is in the Royal Archive. But this one, that's mine. And that's Mission Spacewalk complete. So farts in space, basically in weightlessness, hot air doesn't rise, So the good thing is you probably won't smell your own fart, because by the time you've done it, it's already been taken away by the air conditioning system.